For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means.
Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel.
Tonight's featured show is Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Welcome to the Republic News Network for our live national broadcast. You may call me Kelby, and tonight I'm going to be acting as your moderator. The RNN, which stands for the Republic News Network, has been doing this radio show since 2010, and it's always been a friendly introduction for the people of the United States Corporation. Here we go. It's true. The United States is a federal corporation, and their exclusive jurisdiction is in the District of Columbia. The Republic government was simply a bunch of U.S. citizens that in law don't have access to the Bill of Rights, and they realized they wanted to be Americans as our founders and our law provided each and every one of us. See, we've been hard at work since 2008, and since 2010, we have successfully re-inhabited the original government vacated under Lincoln in 1861. I know, it's hard to understand. Don't worry. We are law-abiding, peaceful Americans and very pro-government, and we love our country. You can consider the Republic members are tired of the corruption that we see every day. See, we found in the law that there is two forms of government here on the land, and we did something about it. We are people. Mothers, fathers, sons, daughters. We have families just like you. We simply found some truths, and now we're sharing these important truths with the rest of the world. So get ready to hear things that sound amazing, and get ready to understand that you too are about to be a part of history. We welcome each one of you to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel and your Republic if you so choose. But before we go into our broadcast tonight, please bow your head in prayer.
Yes, Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this opportunity to just give you thanks and praise. Lord, just bless the call, bless the guests, and just keep them all safe. We thank you for Dan and his this opportunity to continually seek truth and to disseminate truth as appropriately as he feels. Protect him in all that he does, and we pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to yield the floor to Mr. Dan Happel. Dan?
Well, thank you, Kelby. We've got a terrific lineup again. It's the same folks we had on last week, and that is Mary Fanning and Alan Jones. And we are going to continue the discussion that we had last week on the Gulf Tainer, the situation at Port Canaveral, and how all that ties together with a great deal of, in my mind, and I think in their minds as well, treason in the prior administration in the way they administered the contracts to allow Gulf Tainer to take over the very important Port Canaveral, and how that is going to impact our country and has probably already impacted our country because of the very easy way it is for bad things to come in through the ports if they're not properly inspected. And Mary, we've had several conversations since you were last on, but I know that one of the questions that I've had through some of our listeners is the Port Canaveral actually is not where the submarine base is directly, and it is not where Cape Canaveral is directly, but they are very, very close. And for that reason, I'd like you to kind of explain how the Port Canaveral facility is set up and where it's located in proximity to these other facilities.
Well, good evening, Dan. Thank you for having us again. In fact, Port Canaveral is very close to Cape Canaveral, but you mentioned where our submarines are berthed. There are submarines, the Trident submarines, both at Port Canaveral and at Kings Bay. And, in fact, our Trident submarines and the basin, Gulf Tainer is berthed right beside our Trident submarines.
Oh, I did not realize that. Ooh,
yes.
That's even worse.
It is. And that, of course, is a concern because this Port Canaveral is critical infrastructure. There are, just beside Port Canaveral is Cape Canaveral. So there's our space program and our air program. You have Andrews Air Force Base. I think we mentioned before that the E-4B plane, that's our doomsday plane. That's the plane that's always in the air. And that comes in and out of, periodically, not always, very close. And so if there were a nuclear war, that plane is in the air to conduct a nuclear war. And as I said, NASA is there, so that's our space program, but also our satellite programs. And also from the port is where our raid teams used to come out of with the Coast Guard. Now, Barack Obama, in the end of 2015, he dismantled the raid team. The raid team with the Coast Guard would go into the theaters of war and pack up anything that was going to come back in containers into our ports in the United States. They no longer do that. So I'm not certain who is packing things up and sending it into the United States. So that's a problem, as a lot of people see it, people in the military. I don't know if President Trump or our military has done something about that. It's not been announced if it has. So there are many, we have two Air Force bases there, airports. We have our Trident basin, loading basin. NATO's Trident submarines come out of there. Then you have, as we said, NASA. You have the satellites. You have, I'm sure your audience probably pays attention to this, and they saw that as some satellites went up, a few things blew up. And what they didn't hear about was what happened with one of the NATO's, the British Trident submarine. They were going through an exercise, and they fired a missile. It was supposed to go out into the sea toward Africa, not to hit Africa, but just a practice. And it misfired, and it went toward our East Coast, toward Florida.
Wow.
Now, yes, and so Barack Obama made Mr. Cameron, and then after him, the new Prime Minister, May, they were not allowed to talk about this. Well, this was pretty disturbing when you have a Trident submarine misfiring and instead of out into the open seas, coming in toward, and it had to be shot down. And only because the British Royal Navy leaked the information, and I don't know that it's ever hit the U.S. press. We found this information in the British press.
It's amazing, but we see an awful lot of information that isn't coming out in our press that seems to be coming out in European press. And Mary, you and I talked about this issue with the DNA information, and I did send that over to you. I don't know if you had time to look at it, but that's the sort of thing that's being hidden in plain sight, because our press doesn't report on certain things, and yet we have to go over to the European press to find information so that we can put this stuff together so that we can make sense out of it.
And it's not just that it's not being carried by our mainstream media or our papers, but when you have to go searching for this kind of information, and the British Royal Navy releases this rather disturbing information, and the British officials hide it, that's disturbing. And we shouldn't have to go searching for information to see what's out there, what's being hidden from the American people. I think everybody's watched everything that's taken place as President Trump won an election handily, and all they have done is obstruct his agenda. You have Barack Obama, who hasn't, left the stage and moved, 2 miles from the White House, where he's conducting a counteroffensive to the duly elected president of the United States. And a different day, this might have been called treason.
No question about it. And he is running a shadow government that is extremely well funded by the left wing. Well,
the left wing and the likes of Gorgie Schwartz, better known as George Soros, the Nazi sympathizer, collaborator. And so those are some pretty nasty people to have working on your team. But if you don't respect our laws and our Constitution, then you're trying to break it down. Barack Obama had 8 years to do the damage that he did to this country, and the Constitution still stands. So he's still working to dismantle that. And it's our founding documents, and it's what many Americans not only believe in, they celebrate it. They celebrate our rights.
They do, and I think it's also the reason, Mary, that people like you and shows like ours are finally starting to get the attention and the center stage, as it were, because they realize that we can no longer trust the powers that be and the establishment media for truthful, legitimate information about what is going on in our own country.
Well, as we've watched this fusion GPS, this Russia narrative, trying to paint the broad brush of traitor or espionage or working with Russia on Donald J. Trump, it's now, after 1 year of this, after 1 year of day to day, trying to break down this man's administration that the people duly elected him to put into place, it comes out that who funded fusion, who funded this group, who funded this filthy dossier? None other than the Hillary Clinton campaign. This is not just opposition research. This is far more than opposition research. I'm sure your listeners all noted that Hillary Clinton did not have the wherewithal to walk out and say that she'd lost the race that night. And John Podesta came out looking rather shaken and said, "We'll be back tomorrow to talk about this." That's not the way things work in America. And John Podesta, they came back the next day, and lo and behold, they all had their purple ties, and Hillary had her purple suit on. And people who watch these things understand that they were telegraphing to people that this was the purple revolution, just like the revolution that George Soros funded in the Ukraine was the orange revolution. And this is about, people need to keep in mind, we're not just looking at people who disagree or disagree vehemently. We're looking at people who believe in the Antonio Gramsci system of breaking down and destroying a country. This is about killing America. It's not about disagreeing about how we run America.
I just wanted to
you're
elaborate on Mary's great description of the proximity of all the facilities there, but just to kind of try to paint a picture for your listeners, and they might want to go online too and just look up a map of Port Canaveral. But it's located on the east coast of Florida on the Atlantic Ocean, 50 miles east of Orlando. So if you were to take a vacation to Orlando, let's say to Disney or Universal, you might spend a week out there and then decide to take a cruise. So you take a bus 50 miles east out to Port Canaveral, which is the second busiest cruise port in the United States, right after Miami. It's extremely busy. A typical day, you might see 3 or 4 major cruise ships. You get out there, you board your cruise ship, maybe get up on one of the higher decks. Take a look around you. You're going to see the VAB, which is a vehicle assembly building at Kennedy Space Center. That's that big giant building that they used to put the space shuttle in when they were preparing for a launch. I'm sure you've seen it on TV. Also, you're going to see 2 giant cranes, which are gantry cranes, which were brought in from Savannah. They were bought secondhand for Gulf Tanner. And they're right next to these terminals where Royal Caribbean and Disney and Carnival and Norwegian, board these cruises. And you're also going to see a Coast Guard base, which coincidentally is right next door to Gulf Tanner's terminal. Then as your ship pulls out of port, you're going to see the Gulf Tanner terminal there, and behind it is Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, where they do all these launches, SpaceX, top secret Air Force launches. Go a little bit further, we're only talking maybe a quarter mile, half mile at the most from Gulf Tanner's terminal. There is the Trident Turning Basin, which is like a little inlet from the main port channel, which is where the submarines go. The main base for this Atlantic fleet is up in Georgia near Jacksonville at Kings Bay. That's our most important East Coast submarine base. But the submarines also come down there into the port. And then as you come out of the port into the Atlantic Ocean, you're now going into what's called the Eastern Range, and this is where they do these missile tests. It's the most strategically well-positioned place to test missiles. All of our missiles over the years in the Cold War were tested there, from the Polaris, the Minuteman, all the ICBMs. This is where they did the testing. And now they're also doing the testing for the new generation of the Tridents. The British were just over in the Port Canaveral area. It's actually the Air Force station's right there. Patrick Air Force Base is just down the road. But that facility is now being used to test these Trident missiles that are relied on both the U.S. and the British. This is an extremely strategic area. And Gulf Tanner is actually involved in the recovery of the reusable rocket, which SpaceX, which is a private space company, is using now. It's called the Falcon 9. And what that happens is that they launch these rockets with payloads, and then the rocket lands on a barge, and then they bring the barge in, and Gulf Tanner is actually, their terminal is where the recovery is happening. Now, these reusable rockets are now being used for top secret classified missions for the U.S. military, and Gulf Tanner is actually handling the recovery of the rocket itself. It's pretty unbelievable breach of security.
Oh, it really is, yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I'd like to do. You've given us a really good description last week of kind of the connections between the Obama administration and some of the lead officials that were involved with the negotiation on the Gulf Tanner lease program. And I would like to see if you would give us a kind of a brief recap of the Iraqi nuclear program and Dr. Jafar's connections with Gulf Tanner, and then let's briefly get into the joint venture with Rostec, the builder of the, well, I call it a tactical weapon known as the Club K.
Well, this Iraqi nuclear program goes back to the 70s, maybe even a little earlier, when the Soviet Union was providing assistance with an early reactor. That Dr. Jaffer really was on the scene already by the 70s when he was over in Europe studying in Birmingham, studying physics, and then he was at CERN, the reactor in Switzerland. He didn't officially become part of the Iraqi nuclear program until 1981, after the Israelis bombed one of the reactors they suspected had been converted into a weapons program. But unbelievably, Dr. Jaffer was, according to one report, wasn't even on the radar of U.S. intelligence until around 1990, around the time of the Gulf War. We didn't really even know that this guy was out there, even though scientists at CERN in Switzerland had suspected that he was involved in learning about enrichment, and that he was working for some sort of nuclear weapons program. We didn't seem to really catch on to that until later, which is really alarming. And at that point, the Iraqis were very close to having a functioning nuclear weapon.
And we should mention that while Dr. Jaffer was at CERN, the other scientists wrote that they were afraid of him, and they were afraid even to report him. They thought he was looking to weaponize that program for nuclear weapons. And so in the paperwork that we ran across, the scientists that finally wrote him up mentioned that they were afraid to do so, but that they all thought that he was working to weaponize rather than the same purposes that they were working toward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I know last week you said that they were very concerned about him being involved with that super collider project that they were working on.
Yes, but as we started looking, and we really looked into so many different books, and one of the best is probably Under the Baghdad Sun by Shyam Bhatia. And you begin to understand Dr. Jaffer, and it's not clear that he is the good person that they try to represent. Saddam kept him under constant guard for fear that someone would kidnap him, because he was central to their nuclear weapons program. Now, Dr. Jaffer, we ran across CIA documents. He was not just in charge of the nuclear weapon, but also the biological and the chemical weapons program, the procurement for those programs. So he had a far reach against Saddam's programs, even though Dr. Germ and Dr. Tata, those who were also involved in the biological and the chemical weapons program, Dr. Jaffer was overseeing and in charge of procurement for those programs. So he's not just involved in the nuclear program. But as we started looking at him and reading, quite a few different books or research papers on him or CIA documents, and it became clear that he had studied at one point in Moscow, so it wasn't just CERN. And when we first spoke to people in our government who one would think would have had this information, they had no idea that he had ever been in Moscow. And as Alan said, he really didn't come on our radar until 1991. And by that time, he'd already been, 10 years working. But also, when he had applied to stay on at Birmingham and to work there, he did not like the fact that they would not hire him. So that's when he moved on. Then we see him working with the KGB and Yevgeny Primakov. And Primakov is truly the spy master. And when you understand that Dr. Jaffer's relationship was with truly the top spy master, Yevgeny Primakov, who was carrying his sensibilities, he was called virulently anti-Semitic. And so that was in line with Saddam's sensibilities, and also Dr. Jaffer, because Dr. Jaffer felt that when the Israelis had taken out his reactor, that it was terribly unfair, and the fact that the United States let Israel do that, and I don't know that we let Israel do that or not, but that's when he began building what he called the Arab bomb, because he felt that they had been humiliated, and it was time to answer for the Arab world, not just for Iraq.
And what's also really stunning was the scope and size of the program, and that we didn't really know that this program was off the ground or as advanced as it was. Now, Dr. Jaffer was not only in charge of the nuclear program, but also in concealing these programs. This was extremely secretive. I've read one report that they were not allowed to use telephones. They received training from the KGB and how to avoid detection by U.S. satellites, thermal detection and other types of detection. They would sometimes set up these nuclear facilities in dilapidated buildings that would look like some sort of factory that had minimal security, almost no fences, so that the analysts that looked at our reconnaissance photos wouldn't realize that this was an important military installation. They used underground facilities underneath mountains. There are reports of a facility called Site 555, which is in Ken Timmerman's book, Shadow Warriors. He gets into discussing Site 555. But you had this very large program that reportedly received $5 billion from the Saudis, that was receiving technical assistance from the Soviet Union, and it was also using Saddam's oil money. And this was a nuclear arms race. This was a Manhattan Project. And Dr. Jaffer there was thousands of people working on this program, scientists, and they were running parallel programs so that if one approach didn't work, that they had another one going on. And there was a lot of compartmentalization so that one program didn't know what the other was doing. And the key people at the top were in Saddam's family, who really had the keys to these programs. But Dr. Jaffer was very close to Saddam and Saddam's sons, Uday and Qusay, and Camel, who was Saddam's cousin. But this was very, very serious programs, and it's really stunning that we didn't realize how dangerous this program was and how advanced it was.
Right. One of the things that we found really interesting is that Dr. Jaffer's program and the scientists and the technicians that worked for him, it was equal to the size of our CIA. That's not a minor program.
No, that's for sure.
Just the enrichment, they were pursuing lots of different technologies, not only the electromagnetic isotope separation, which Dr. Jaffer kind of perfected and improved on, but also plasma, centrifuges, lasers. They were looking at multiple delivery systems. They had very elaborate plans in case of an invasion or in case of some other situation where they had to hide everything. They had plans to put everything on optical discs, to bury things, to move them. This was extremely well thought out, and they had all kinds of contingencies for situations like the Iraq War, which is why this is very troubling, because they had contingencies, and we went into Iraq, and now we've left. We never even inspected all the sites, as one of our sources who was actually over there told us, and this is public information. But it's very, very troubling because we don't know what sort of WMD was left behind, where it is, how much of it is. It can be reassembled, where it's being reassembled. We don't know what's going on, and that's what's alarming.
Well, we did find out through some documents and also Ken Timmerman's book, and that was that there were the Soviet generals had come in, as well as Yevgeny Primakov, and they were moving these WMDs, but also all the documentation that the Soviets had been working with Saddam and Dr. Jaffer for a very long time. And they were moving these out. They actually had Boeing 747s and 727s, and they made 56 sorties into Syria. And so as they made these trips, they said that they were there on a mission because a dam had broken, and this was a mission to help and sort of a bit of a Red Cross moment that they were flying all these things. But what they were flying in were, in fact, the WMD. They also had Soviet generals come in. They made sure that no one dressed in any their Soviet garb, and that they were moving chemical weapons, all sorts of things, into Iran, into Syria. These generals were managing this whole program. And
this was 2003, so this was under Putin, Russian Federation.
Right. And you know, I think our listeners need to understand that even though all we've heard was, well, Bush and Rumsfeld and all these folks lied about the WMD program that Hussein had, was actually not there at all. And I know from reading some of General Vallely's reports and other people that, in fact, it was just moved out of the country by the Russians primarily.
Yes, but there's more than that. It was a political operation. Tyler Drumheller was in charge of the European office, and he was going on 60 Minutes and came up with the political Bush lied, people died. And then that narrative picked up speed. And you have to understand that Tyler Drumheller's wife was working for John Kerry, and at that time his campaign to run for president. And so the last thing they wanted to show was that, in fact, that there were WMD in Iraq, and that we went in there for a very good reason. Not only had the WMD been moved into Syria and into Iran, but they knew Dr. Jaffer was on the blacklist. That's CENTCOM's blacklist. That means that we had put out putting him on the blacklist means that shoot to kill. So imagine that this man that is put on CENTCOM's blacklist is, with his family, handed a 35-year lease with no CFIUS oversight to a critical infrastructure military port. Cargo container. Mm-hmm. So it's not the whole port, it's the cargo container operation. However, you have to keep in mind that the cargo container operations at any and every port in the United States are considered as the most likely, most vulnerable area for a WMD to come into this country. Now, a weapons of mass effect did come in, and it was found at Port of San Diego. And when the man who was part of Homeland Security and part of the port, a port official as well, his name is Al Haller, when he was questioned, and poor Al Haller, here's a man that just can't lie. So he's asked, has anything ever happened in this port? And he starts choking. And his minder says that he can't, he cannot tell the truth. And he goes and, it attracts attention. And he says, well, yeah, something did come in. And Fox News picked it up, and they started talking about it, and the local news had picked it up. And so a weapon of mass effect had come in. We talked to the man who used to be Secret Service, and then he became a top consultant on ports and airport security. And Al Haller was promptly called to Washington, D.C. and fired, and he could no longer speak to it, and he does not. But when he told the story, that broke into the news. So once again, something had happened, and the Obama administration hid those facts from the American people.
Now, Pachipa, who was an intelligence agent who worked in Romania. Now, he was actually also working for the KGB, which the official story was that Romania was independent of the Soviet Union and was, an independent communist country. I don't think that was true at all. They were working with the Soviets all along, another deception. But Pachipa talked about this plan called emergency exit, which is what happened under Primakov with these Russian special forces generals that were on the ground, removing the WMD out of Iraq into Syria and other places. But there was more to emergency exit. It was actually several components of what you do in a situation where a country like the U.S. is going to come in to a country that has WMDs that were provided by Russia. And the other part of that, besides removing and hiding them, was to then institute a propaganda campaign to discredit the invading country, to embarrass them by coming up with a situation where they don't find any WMD, and then also discredit the leaders who thought there were WMDs and portray them as liars. And that's exactly what happened. This was actually the playbook from the Soviets that had been drawn up years ago and then passed down through Putin, and then actually went into an operational procedure that happened under the direction of Primakov. And they then said there were no WMDs. Bush lied, people died, and the WMDs were moved out of Iraq.
In fact, they had practices many times where they quickly picked everything up, practiced getting it out of the country, getting all the documentation, proving the relationship between the Soviets and Saddam. In fact, Yevgeny Primakov, he had, as we said, had the KGB at one point. He was a Soviet ambassador to Iraq. His own personal plane was said to have been used, that he was taking things out of the country, while on the world stage, he said he was trying to talk to Iraq to come, to their senses and to agree to the operation to come in and do the proper inspections.
And there was even a third component of that, which was Soviet or Russian intelligence-controlled peace movements throughout Europe that could be activated to set up protests. And that's exactly what happened right before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. You had these protests break out all over Europe saying, the U.S. is imperialist, this is an unjustified war. And that was actually all being directed by the Russians. So the Russians were moving the WMDs out. They were setting up protests all over the world, and they were setting up to discredit that there were no WMDs and that we lied.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think what we need to do, because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time again, let's move into a discussion about what Rostec is, their connection with the Port Canaveral facility, with Dr. Jafar and the Iraqi nuclear program, and then how Vladimir Putin enters into the picture with the Club K program through Rostec. Mary, do you want to start that?
Sure. So as we looked and thought, what could possibly go wrong, we started looking at Dr. Jaffer, and we began to see his Soviet-Russian connections, and that he'd been working with Primakov for a very long time. His entire career working with the KGB. And so at that point, over 5 years ago, something had come on the market called the Club K. The Club K looks like a normal cargo container. However, the top opens up, and it is managed by satellite, and it can shoot off cruise missiles. It can shoot off an EMP. But because the Obama administration had, even though Congress had mandated 100% of cargo containers must be inspected coming into the country, they had brought it down to less than 2% under Jay Johnson. And so who knew what was coming in the country? So when this Club K, which they refer to as Pandora's box or Doomsday box. So here are these cargo containers that have a very serious weapon system managed by satellite that can be coming into the country, and they can be all over the country. They also don't just stay at the port that they come into. They get on rail, they get on trucks, riverines, so they go to every hamlet in the United States. So as we looked at the Club K, which is manufactured by Rostec, which is the weapons manufacturing of the Russian Soviet government. It started out, it was the Soviet, but then Putin put this into play when the man who created Rostec became part of, Rossoboron Export became part of Rostec. We look
Putin
at this.
is actually a partner or part owner of this. Am I correct in that?
Well, it's actually a joint venture, and it can get very confusing looking at all these Russian companies because they call them these joint stock companies, but they're really state-owned companies, and they are set up to look like capitalist corporations, but they're sort of the new version of Soviet company. And Rossoboron Export has been around for a long time. They have a monopoly on arms exporting out of Russia. And Rossoboron Export was sort of the predecessor of Rostec, which was set up in 2007 by Vladimir Putin. All these state-owned companies, and particularly Rossoboron Export and Rostec, which is now its parent company, are run by former KGB guys. And Rossoboron Export is run by a former KGB Special Forces guy. Rostec is run by a KGB guy who was stationed in Dresden, East Germany with Putin. They were actually reportedly lived in the same apartment complex. So this is the inner circle out of St. Petersburg of Putin's guys.
And they're KGB running guys.
Yes.
But beyond that, the man who initially owned Rossoboron Export worked very closely with Yevgeny Primakov.
Yeah, one of the earlier directors.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So as we looked into the Rostec Rossoboron Export, the exporter of the Club K, we found that Gulf Tainer had gone into a joint venture with Rostec, which owns 100% of the stock of Rossoboron Export. So the people who were given a 35-year lease with no CFIUS overview and a secret deal called Project Pelican, where the American people didn't know about it until it was announced and signed, even though Jack Lew went over to the UAE 10 days beforehand and was quoted as saying he was talking about security and real estate, even though it did not receive any CFIUS review as mandated under the 2007 PHMSA law because of the Dubai Ports World debacle. The family that was given the Gulf Tainer lease to Port Canaveral, Gulf Tainer was in a joint venture with Rostec, the exporter of the Club K Doomsday box.
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Now, I read in one of your reports that the shelf life on the Club K is, on each one of these units, is no less than 10 years. They can be transported literally anywhere in the country, and they have a shelf life of 10 years. And would you describe some of the munitions and some of the capabilities that they can put inside one of these containers, and maybe talk about how it can be directed around the country and how that could work?
So the Club K is a modular system. One of the main modules is the launching module. They all look like containers. The launching module is actually going to contain the missiles themselves. You also have other modules that can contain guidance systems, such as drone helicopters that can be used for targeting and then directing the missiles. They can also be directed by satellites. Now, the primary missile that they were designed to work with is called the Caliber missile. Now, there are also reports that there's another generation of missile with a NATO nickname of Switchblade. I'm not as familiar with the Switchblade, but the Caliber missiles are very well established now in the Russian Navy. This is a cruise missile, which is comparable to our Tomahawks. Some reports say that they're actually superior to the Tomahawk, which is an older missile. But they are being used, the Calibers are being used in Russian frigates and corvettes and submarines, and they're retrofitting the Russian Akula class and other class submarines with these Calibers. Now, that you can put 4 Caliber missiles inside one Club K module, which is a container. So like Mary said, the top will open up. It can either do a vertical launch or launch at an angle. The cruise missiles can then travel at a subsonic speed, which means slower than the speed of sound. And certain variations of them can do a second stage, which is a supersonic stage. And the supersonic stage is almost impossible to stop as it approaches, for example, a carrier. And just 1 or 2 Caliber cruise missiles can, with conventional weapons, take out an entire aircraft carrier. That gives you an idea of how sophisticated these weapons are.
And they can start out at subsonic and change speed after they're fired to supersonic.
Right, right. Now, let's talk about how these can be deployed around the country and why we have a real concern about this. And then I know you're not prepared to really address this in full detail, but I think our listeners need to understand how important the prospects of having these type of weapons systems scattered all over the country, and then how that might tie into an electromagnetic pulse weapon system, and how bad that could be for our entire country.
Well, these Caliber missiles can carry conventional weapons, or they can carry nuclear warheads, including the EMP, which is a type of small nuclear explosion. I'm not an expert on this, obviously. Dr. Peter Pry is the #1 authority on the EMP, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it, but the reports are that they can put an EMP on one of these missiles. Now, back in the Cold War days, everything was ICBMs and long-range bombers and submarines, so the Russians could never have dreamt back in the 80s that they could actually have their weapons of mass destruction on missiles located in America. This is something that would have been science fiction or a pipe dream only 30 years ago. And now, unfortunately, it's a reality that the possibility that these are already in the country is very alarming, because there's really no advance warning if they launch. NORAD, which is our early detection system, is geared toward looking for, inbound threats coming from overseas. Like when you look on TV reports about Kim Jong-un, it shows a little track going across the globe, toward Japan or towards Guam or toward California. Well, that's an ICBM, which is bad enough. Those can only take maybe 30 minutes to reach their target. But when you're talking about cruise missiles inside these Club K containers, they can reach their targets in less than 30 seconds. So if these were positioned near military installations here in the U.S., near our major Navy bases, near our major Air Force installations, or near the Pentagon, any of these places, there's really no advance notice, and it would be devastating destruction before we even really knew what hit us. That's what's very alarming.
Right. It's the enemy within, to the point where we really don't have any defensive systems designed to even consider this kind of an attack.
That's why it's so important to stop them from getting here.
Dr. Pry addressed this, and he said, if the next war is not going to be anything like the last war, and because of the Club K, he speaks to asymmetrical warfare, and that's coming from a lot of different areas. And in fact, as we looked into the history of Dr. Jaffer working with Primakov, we came across the Islamic bloc, and that was where the Russians and Soviets went in, and they purposefully created the Red-Green Alliance in order to radicalize parts of Islam with seething hatred toward the United States. And so they put together the Islamic bloc of Iran, Iraq, Syria. Not only did they do that, at the same time, they started working with North Korea. So Dr. Jaffer began working with North Korea in the Damascus meeting. And he was working with them because he was looking for a delivery system for his miniaturized nuclear weapon, Beach Ball. And so he refers to it either as Beach Ball or the Arab bomb. So, we have a lot of bad actors who have come together who feel that their target is the big Satan and little Satan that's been sold to them, that America and Israel are the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Well, how can we deal with this internal threat? Is there a way that we can actually? We don't know where these things are, and they could have been coming in for the last 8 years.
That's right.
Is there a way that we can try to track down and identify these Club K containers, and is there a way that we can try to neutralize them?
Well, the containers, Congress already mandated that 100% of containers coming into this country must be inspected. Now, Glenn Wynn, the authority that we spoke to, who was in the Secret Service and is the Ports and Airport Authority, said, while you may not be able to inspect every container, you had better know to whom you give your lease, because those people are very important. So the idea of giving it to, a Dr. Jaffer Dia Jaffer having a 35-year lease who is also in business with those who export the Club K is beyond a nightmare. But also, it's not just Dr. Jaffer. His brother was also under investigation by the Treasury Department and committees in Congress for his selling oil for superweapons in order to fund Saddam and his brother's WMD program. So it's not just one member of the family. It's both brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Gulf Container actually controls 40% of the cargo container terminals in the Middle East at this point. They've got operations in Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Turkey, in quite a few countries. So they've got a terminal here. So conceivably, they have control of loading and unloading a container that might contain a Club K, for example, on both sides of the ocean, which is very troubling. And
right.
We really, to answer your question, is, the U.S. needs to adapt to this asymmetrical warfare, that the new reality. I mean, they talk about cyber threats, which is important too, but there's much more to it. And this is not 1950 anymore. Things have changed tremendously. The Club K has been referred to as a game changer. Our EMP preparations apparently are almost non-existent. We haven't hardened the electrical grid. So we need to realize that a failure of imagination, which is a term that was thrown around after the 9/11 attack, is our weakness. And if we don't imagine these worst-case asymmetrical scenarios and take them seriously and adapt and task our military brightest minds to figure out how to get some kind of defenses against this, it's really not a question of if, but when.
Right.
In fact, there's one congressman who has been speaking out about our national security, and that is Ron DeSantis. And Congressman DeSantis is a congressman from Florida. His district borders close to Port Canaveral. But he's a man who served in the military, and he apparently has the intestinal fortitude to actually speak out. General Vallely, his written papers about the Club K, he knew how dangerous this is. But really, every one of your listeners should be calling Congressman DeSantis' office first and then start with every other one of our representatives. What are they doing in Washington, D.C., when there is a threat like this and they have not done anything? We have spoken with several congressmen who were working on this. This isn't something that you kind of put to the back of the line and maybe get to next year. This is an immediate threat. This is a clear and present danger.
The only thing we've seen written so far is in one of the recent NDAAs, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, where Congress gives the money every year to the Pentagon. And they actually wrote in one of the recent NDAAs that the Pentagon is now required to notify Congress anytime they learn that Russia has exported the Club K to another country. So technically under law, Congress is supposed to be at least notified which of these countries is getting Club Ks. Maybe that's in classified briefings, I don't know. But we haven't seen any real evidence of a major program to try to counter this threat, which is, it's going to take cooperation, I think, with Homeland Security, with the Department of Energy, with the Department of Transportation, with the Pentagon, the Air Force, with the Coast Guard. It's going to require a lot of coordination and people putting their heads together, getting the money, getting the technology, getting the human intelligence to find out where these things are, where they're leaving, where they're being built in Russia, where they're being moved, who's moving them. We need to really find out, get a handle on this right away.
And the other thing is, yes, we need a full court press on this. But it's important to remember that Dr. Peter Pry is our foremost authority on EMP. He just came out and talked about Iran now has the Club K. And that's important. Iran is, the same loose cannon that North Korea is. The idea that we made this Iran deal is nothing short of a nightmare.
Well, you're right, and the thing that concerns me about all this is that right now we're in the middle of a lease with a group or a company that we have no business being involved in a lease with. Why can't we just negate that lease, and then why don't we go after the people that initiated this lease, which in my mind it's pretty easy to track that back to the Obama administration and the Clinton State Department. Yes, it is. But, someone's going to have to pay attention to this, because at this point they're making sure that have you ever seen the news, Faster or Harder in your life? I've likened this to a batting cage. You get in it and they keep turning up the speed of the ball so that you're trying to hit the balls as fast as you can, and they're making sure that is the case. Mm-hmm. So, America has to get a grip and say this is wrong and we want this reverse engineered immediately. Really, I don't know what the heck is wrong with the governor of Florida, but he should have sent in the National Guard and taken over that port and inspected every last thing in it. You don't hand over a critical infrastructure to a designated enemy combatant terrorist. Right. Well, and the thing is, let's assume that all these containers that come in are innocently filled with goods and toys and all this stuff. What is the big deal about doing an inspection on them as they come in to a port held by someone of questionable character? Someone of questionable character shouldn't be holding a port cargo container operation at all. That's right. And but let's assume that we're stuck with this thing, although I don't think we should be. No. But let's assume we're stuck with this thing for a short period of time. What's the big deal about requiring that all the containers that come into this country be inspected when they go through that port? It's already been mandated. It should be every cargo container coming into the country, period. Right. The globe has heated up. It's not the time to be lax.
The Coast Guard has the authority even to stop an inbound container ship, I don't know how many, 12 miles off the coast. They can go ahead and stop them out there and inspect them before they even get into the port. They need to be proactive.
But beyond that, as the Russians were talking about selling the Club K, and they say, should someone in their videos shoot off, missiles or whatever, the whatever ship or boat or whatever is carrying the Club K has the ability to self-destruct, so that whomever gets hit by it never knows who was even carrying the Club K.
Right. That's also another concern when it's something that can be, let's say, shot from the interior of the country, and it can destroy itself once it's spent the munitions that are, there's no way to even determine who was actually responsible for it.
There was a paper that was written a few years back by someone, I don't know if he was maybe Naval Postgraduate School or one of these war colleges, but he wrote a paper in which the scenario was a freighter was off the coast of Virginia early in the morning, and that the Club K was launched headed toward Norfolk or a major Navy base. And then after the missiles left, the freighter then self-destructed and sank, so that all the evidence went to the bottom of the ocean, so that basically we got a situation like Pearl Harbor where our Navy base is hit with these cruise missiles and we have no idea where they came from or who launched them.
Right. That's a huge concern. Well, Mary, I know I'm attempting to try to get Dr. Pry on a radio show sometime soon, because I do really want to find out more about the EMP weapons systems. And you know that I've kind of studied this a little on my own anyway, and that's a major concern to me, that something as simple as hardening our systems to electromagnetic pulse attacks, and we haven't done it. And it's literally a $5 or $6 billion fix that could be done very quickly if we were just to do it, and Congress has refused to act on this.
Yeah, go figure. But Dr. Peter Pry said that had this been the greatest generation, this would have been taken care of already. And,
right.
He's the foremost authority. He knows that this must be done.
Well, let's hope we can get him on the radio show, because we do need to talk about this, and we do need to continue with an investigation of this. And Mary and Alan, I have to thank you profusely for having the guts to come before the American public and explain just exactly how bad this situation is, and really what we need to do to fix it. And what we need to do is get off our dead butts and get in contact with our elected officials, our congressmen and our senators, and say we cannot allow this to continue the way it is, and we need to start doing something about it now.
Well, and your listeners need to remember something. They work for us. Call them up and tell them to get off of their duffs and get this taken care of.
That's true.
Now, if your listeners go on...
I'm sorry, Alan, go ahead.
I was going to suggest if your listeners go on to YouTube and just look up Club K, they're going to find a bunch of these computer animated videos that were actually created by the manufacturer of the Club K in Russia. And, a video's worth 1,000 words. It shows you the capabilities of these weapons. If they start sending these videos to members of Congress, posting them on the Facebook pages of their representatives with a message like, what are you going to do about this? What are you doing to protect us from this threat? And that could go viral.
Well, and they can also go to the Center for Security Policy.org and get our paper. It's under the occasional papers, and it's the perfect storm. Send that link to your representatives and tell them to wake up.
Well, I think it's obviously time that we do this, because I don't know how much longer we have if we continue to act so stupidly about such an enormous threat right here in our own country. And all I can say is thank you for awaking our listeners, and let's hope that they get on the phone and they get on email and they send this information out. So with that, Mary and Alan, I thank you again for being on our radio show, and I will definitely have you back on. I'd love to continue this conversation as you find out more and more of the things that are happening. And I would remind our listeners, it's time that we hold the people that are responsible for bringing this disaster to our country, hold them accountable, and support President Trump and go after the people that caused this problem in the first place. So thank you again, and Kelby, I turn the show back over to you, and thank our listeners and ask them to come back next week.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.